I am thrilled today to have Dr. Thomas Eisenmann, who is a professor of business administration at the Harvard Business School. In addition to that, Dr. Eisenmann, you do like 29 other things at Harvard to keep yourself busy, all around the idea of entrepreneurship, innovation. Tell us a little bit about how you got interested in all of this as your academic area.
Well, I had a midlife crisis. Some folks get a red sports car.
Yes.
I got a doctorate in my late 30s, which is on the old side. I mean, there are people who do it at that age. And I joined, and I'd been a management consultant, and I was fascinated with media and entertainment companies. I did my doctoral thesis on the U.S. cable television industry. And I thought I was studying strategic decision-making in big companies. But in fact, the folks who built cable TV systems all around the United States were and still are entrepreneurs. So it was a slow realization that I was actually studying entrepreneurs. And I got pulled pretty quickly when I arrived at Harvard Business School on the faculty, finished the thesis into a course on internet business models. I had done that kind of work as a consultant, and of course, there's all sorts of entrepreneurship. This was 1998. It was a great place to be. Armed guards at the doors, trying to keep the students out because everybody wanted to study the internet. So the combination of all that sort of put me on the path. But it was not until many years later I actually started to teach a course on how you manage a startup. I mean, everything I'd done up to that point was high-level strategy. And once I started to actually study how entrepreneurs find the idea, figure out if they've got a good idea, assemble the team, raise the money, all that stuff, I really fell in love, and I never turned back. And from that point on, I was all about let's just launch course after course with co-instructors, collaborators, and sort of toss them the keys and say, okay, you drive that one. I'm going to go do another one. So entrepreneurial marketing and product management and so on and so forth. And eventually, of course, on entrepreneurial failure.
There you go. Well, in addition to all those courses that you've created, you lead the Harvard Innovation Labs. You also lead the HBS Rock Center for Entrepreneurship. And as you think about entrepreneurship and innovation, as your writings reflect, failure is just a part of those processes. And you've written a book in terms of looking at how it is that startups fail. And out of all of your research and all of the hundreds of startups that you've looked at, you've been able to identify 5 or 6 things that seem to be common in terms of an entrepreneurial failure. Talk to us a little bit about what you've learned from looking at all of these different companies that have had a go at it, but didn't quite pull it off.
Yeah. So some people, if you sort of ask them why do startups fail, you get an answer that, well, it's simple. They run out of money and they can't raise more.
Right?
That is exactly right. It is actually the reason that most startups fail. There are other reasons, by the way. There is such a thing as raising too much money. Well, we can come back to that. So that's kind of like a coroner saying the cause of death was loss of blood. It's not terribly helpful. And as I studied failure, what I realized is we have a very human tendency to oversimplify complicated things. It sort of makes navigating the world easier if we've got a quick explanation. And an awful lot of people, again, sort of they try to push a little deeper on why startups fail. They will pin the tail on the donkey, blame the horse. Investors and some entrepreneurs and many venture capitalists will talk about horse and jockey. I guess that resonates in your part of the world, in Tennessee. Again, that's an oversimplification. Sort of the notion that it's either just a flawed idea, a slow horse, or a not talented jockey, an entrepreneur who's just not suited for the role, tends to oversimplify. So I found recurring patterns. 3 of them are early stage failures, sort of when an entrepreneur is just getting going, sort of searching for the idea, assembling the resources, the team, and so forth, raising the money. And 3 of them are later stage. Surprisingly, firms, even as they're scaling up, something like 1 out of 3 will still fail at that stage. And your listeners won't be surprised by that. If you don't try something new and bold and ambitious, you're on safe ground. So entrepreneurs who, by definition, are trying something new with limited resources, we should expect them to fail. We should actually want them to fail. I mean, society needs people to try things. What we'd like to do, though, is avoid unnecessary failure and make it a good failure. There is a concept of a good failure out there, and there are plenty of them.
As people think about entrepreneurship and innovation, as they begin to contemplate both the success and the change that can come from those processes, but then also have to deal with the sobering reality that there might be failure involved, give us a little sense in terms of how is it that you define entrepreneurship, or what is it in terms of people think about innovation and they just think about a light bulb and change and creativity, but really, what is it that people are doing in these processes that makes themselves vulnerable to failure?
Yeah, so we have a definition of entrepreneurship that we use at Harvard Business School. My mentor, I actually hold a chaired professorship named after him, Howard Stevenson, is the guy who coined this. And it's pretty simple. It's basically the pursuit of novel opportunity without all the resources required to exploit that opportunity. So doing something new, by its nature risky, without all the resources, at least at the outset. I mean, eventually you're going to have to go get the resources from somebody or somewhere. And that's the core of entrepreneurship. And what that means is you can find entrepreneurs anywhere in government agencies. My colleague, I know you know Mitch Weiss. He's just written a book about entrepreneurship in government agencies and big companies. So as an example, Google launching Google Drive is not very entrepreneurial. I mean, they did it after Dropbox and Box and Mosey and Carbonite and other services were out there. So it wasn't something new. And when they did it, they had hundreds of millions of customer relationships. They had legions, armies of computer scientists who could work on the thing. They had data centers everywhere. So it was innovation of a sort. It was something new for Google, but it was not a novel opportunity without resources. They had plenty of resources. When Drew Houston launched Dropbox, that's entrepreneurship, right? He had a concept burning bright. He actually got the idea for it. He forgot to bring a thumb drive with him on a bus trip to New York City, and realized, wow, I spent my whole life leaving my thumb drive behind and, not being able to do work for the next 4 hours. And, he had his laptop, so he started coding the thing on the bus. And, there's the pursuit of opportunity without any resources. All he had was his knowledge of computer science gained at MIT. So that's and it's just going to expose you to failure every step of the way. Or you may fail because you've got a bad idea, and you may become, as entrepreneurs often do, emotionally attached to your idea and just stubbornly insist that it's going to work, even though it hasn't been working for the last 10 months. If you don't mobilize those resources, the team, the money, the distribution channels you need to get your product to market, then it isn't going to work. Sometimes, tragically, entrepreneurs have a good idea, but they just can't get the set of players together that are going to make the idea come to life. And sometimes they've actually got a good set of resources, good team, supportive investors, supportive partners, but they just can't make it in time after iterating the idea to a truly good idea. So you see both patterns: good idea, flawed resource package, and just the opposite of that.
And so what is it that we can learn from entrepreneurs about their view of failure? How do they see failure differently, in a way that's constructive, or perhaps in a way that is energizing and moves them forward, as opposed to the natural reaction of, well, there's risk, I want to avoid risk, and so I don't do anything at all?
Yeah, so we should be clear. When I'm talking about failure, I'm talking about a failure of the entire enterprise. Like, there was a company, now there is no company. And I mean, because there are many, many, many small failures, even in a successful enterprise. There's going to be lots of small failure along the way, which hopefully you learn from and move past. So we're talking about the big one here, and I think what's really stands out in terms of what listeners can learn from how entrepreneurs deal with this. It is painful. I mean, so many different types of. I mean, I've listened to some of your episodes and athletes, and I mean, failure is often painful. But the thing about an entrepreneur is their identity is intertwined with the venture. I mean, Drew Houston is Dropbox. Dropbox is Drew Houston. So if it fails, he can't escape the fact that a big, big part of him is a failure. And it hurts. It just hurts. It hurts in an ego sense. It often, I mean, many entrepreneurs will be putting all of their life savings. They'll take their credit card debt up to the max and then beyond. And so it hurts financially. It hurts socially. I mean, most entrepreneurs are working so hard on their venture that they've even successful entrepreneurs have probably trashed their personal relationships, right? You're working 70, 80-hour weeks. Your friends, after the fourth time you've not shown up for a dinner, sort of start to get tired of you, and they don't call you anymore. Your spouse gets tired of, sort of you coming home exhausted. I have one entrepreneur I brought into my class who sort of talks about vacuuming the same spot over and over again in the house, or dutifully doing chores, but realizing that he has just literally spent the last 15 minutes vacuuming the same spot because he's so caught up in thinking about the venture. Or he's listening to his child sort of tell an enchanted child telling a story about something that happened today, and nodding and realizing, he's nodding and encouraging the child, but he has no idea what the child has just said. It hurts. It hurts so much. And so, what observing entrepreneurs rebound from the failure, there's this period of heat of pain, and the best entrepreneurs will alternate between ruminating on what happened. You can't escape that. You're gonna think about it, and distraction. You need both, right? You do need to grapple with it, and if you spend all your time ruminating, you'll slip into clinical depression. Truly, many entrepreneurs will become clinically depressed, and it's tragic because they don't often have people that they can talk to. A lot of young people in a company who've never in their life experience dealt with mental illness, and a lot of pressure, and not often good medical benefits. So yikes, it's not a prescription. And once the company's done, even the benefits have gone away. Hopefully you've got Cobra. So so I can keep going, but you want me to keep going with the healing process, or do you want to dive in?
I'd love to. I mean, that leads to really a next question in terms of thinking about that, because I think it's really important, because everyone's going to experience failure at some point in their life, at some level. Some, like you just described, may be much more public, and people may not be able to just tuck those away to where they don't talk about them anymore. Others, they have different kind of failures, maybe not as large, not as grand, but still the same emotions, the same sense of reaction to it. Talk a little bit about what you've seen in terms of entrepreneurs that have learned how to deal with failure in a healthy way. What do they do different?
Yeah. So step one is working through the pain, through this combination of rumination and distraction. Dean Shepard is a professor at Notre Dame, has actually studied the psychology of failure deeply. You should have him as a guest. There's not an academic out there who's thought more deeply about failure than this guy. And then that sets you up to be able to actually learn. You need a little bit of distance, and it can take months. And the distraction can be exercise. It can be a new hobby. It can be a consulting project, just something different, something new to keep your mind on other things. Then the learning is a tricky thing. And unfortunately, I think a pretty sizable fraction of entrepreneurs don't learn or they learn in very, very faulty ways. And so think of a continuum where at one extreme, you have individuals who, in an ego defensive way, accept no blame for what happened. My co-founder dropped the ball. My investors pushed for the wrong strategy. The regulators did something irrational and unexpected. The capital markets just suddenly dried up. A pandemic hit and demand evaporated. So sometimes it's true. All of those things do happen. Sometimes it is true that the entrepreneur is not at fault, and we should recognize that. But usually, that entrepreneur picked the co-founder and picked the investor. So they have to start to ask some questions about, okay, yeah, maybe your co-founder did disengage, but maybe you weren't very easy to work with, and that was the wrong co-founder in the first place. At the other extreme is equally, and so this founder has learned nothing from the failure. They are likely to get on the horse and ride over the same cliff again, making the same mistakes, and that's bad. If in fact anybody will back them or any team members will join them. At the other extreme are founders who actually beat themselves up too much. They take too much responsibility for the failure. I was hapless and hopeless as an entrepreneur. I shouldn't have done it. I should never do it again. And again, there are some people who should not be entrepreneurs just temperamentally. But usually it's the case that these folks are taking too much responsibility, and society is actually deprived. If these people actually got back on the horse and rode again and learned something, we would all benefit from the companies they created, the jobs they created, the problems they solved. So in the middle are people who actually get enough distance. Their ego lets them actually come to grips with what happened and their role in it. And boy, these are the folks that are actually set up once the introspection's done to do something again. Surprising fraction, John, of them go back and do another startup. So half of failed founders will go and start another company. Some of them are at the end of that extreme that they shouldn't. They haven't learned anything and they're going to fail again. But the ones who've learned, and they're in a pretty good position to do it. So what you find is that if you can explain what went wrong, what your role in it was, what you learned from it, and what you'll do differently, it helps in attracting team members. It helps in attracting investors. So though, and indeed, you will have learned from the experience. So that's a fraction of the failed founders, and they really have gained from the experience. And I think the world recognizes that. Investors recognize that. Teammates recognize it.
It's interesting. You talk about how investors, you would think that a failure would just naturally turn investors away. But as I hear you talk, it sounds like the fact that someone's been through an entrepreneurial process, and if they've learned from it, that actually is something that can be more attractive to someone who's thinking about partnering up with you, knowing that experience exists.
Yeah, subject to the qualifier that entrepreneur can explain what happened and what they learned. And I think the best investors are going to be pretty savvy about probing for exactly that. Is this somebody who is sort of caught in defending their own ego, or is this somebody who really has learned?
Sure. Let's jump into your book a little bit, because there was a couple of things in terms of the 6 things that you identified. There was a couple of them that I think you can categorize together, maybe perhaps, that is a little surprising to me, in that it seems as though ambition can be a source of failure when you're either attempting to do something that perhaps is a bit beyond the scope of the entrepreneurial process that you're on, or you try to grow it so quickly that you get out over your skis, and as a result of that, things get out of control. Talk a little bit about that balance there between having the right ambition and being able to manage the prospect of failure.
Wow. I never thought about it this way before, but ambition, and let me twist it a few degrees and label it overconfidence, is at the core of at least 4 of the 6 failure patterns. And let me play a couple of them out to give a feel for what's going on. The failure patterns sort into, I think I've already mentioned, early stage and later stage. And so the most fascinating one in this regard is, I call it cascading miracles. I stole the term from a CEO who stole the term from somebody else. It goes back to Monty Shapiro. I got it from John Malone, who was one of these cable entrepreneurs I mentioned earlier. He got it from Monty Shapiro, who was the entrepreneur who built the set-top box, the thing that sits on top of your TV set. And the notion is we have a big, bold, audaciously bold entrepreneurial concept. People might remember Iridium, which was going to put, you could use a phone anywhere on the brick-sized phone, use it anywhere on the planet because you were going to talk to a satellite, and we were going to put 70 or 80 satellites in low Earth orbit. Segway, we remember those, a big, bold idea. Webvan, if people remember back to the dot-com boom, when we take online grocery delivery for granted once, the first company that tried it lost $1 billion trying it. And sometimes it works. I mean, Tesla is an example of cascading miracles. So the notion is there's a bunch of things that have to go right. And each of them is a pretty significant uncertainty, whether it's actually going to work, because, again, we're doing new stuff. So examples, fundamental change in consumer behavior. When Tesla got going with electric cars, would people trust them? If first Tesla Roadster only went 100 miles before you needed a recharge. Fundamental change in customer behavior, often the cooperation of big established companies, for Iridium, the incumbent telephone companies, government permission, Iridium over and over again. Segway, can we drive these things on the sidewalk? Can they go in the street? And huge amounts of capital because the product development cycle takes so long, and on and on. And each of these is like a coin flip, whether it's going to work. You just can't be sure in advance. And if you flip a coin 5 times, the chance of getting heads 5 times in a row, each of the outcomes being a good outcome, is 3%. It's the same as spinning a roulette wheel and picking a number on the wheel. And so sometimes it works, like Tesla or SpaceX. I mean, Elon Musk seems to have the magic touch for these cascading miracles, but often it's the case that that something goes wrong. And when these things fail, again, we've raised usually hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars. They leave these giant steaming craters in the landscape. These are the ones we hear about. This is Theranos, which many people will remember. And what's at the core of a cascading miracles failure is a charismatic founder who is essentially, we pattern them on Steve Jobs. There's a description of Steve Jobs, which he had a reality distortion field. It comes originally from a Star Trek episode, but Jobs could basically, by painting this incredibly mesmerizing, compelling vision of the future, convince people to do things they wouldn't normally do. Employees to work 80-hour weeks for a year on end, partners to join, investors to put money in, and the entrepreneurs who pursue the cascading miracles can do this. They actually are these mesmerizing types. But there's just this fine line between the confidence and charisma of a dazzling entrepreneur and the self-possessed compulsion of a narcissist. And a lot of these founders you'll turn out to find out that they actually narcissists turn out to be very articulate and engaging on first impression, but you don't often want to work for one for a long time. So anyway, the overconfidence will lead the reality distortion field to fold back on itself. So instead of bending reality to your will as the entrepreneur, the field is clouding you from actually seeing the reality around you. And at this point, the narcissist has surrounded himself or herself with yes men, so no one's going to challenge them. So the thing can go on for a long time and get into a lot of trouble before there's a course correction. Course correction usually takes the point of investors eventually getting fed up and after they're $1 billion deep, not being willing to put the next 400 million in.
So what is the antidote you see as far as people who need to be a bit irrationally confident to keep going after folks say no and no and no, but at the same time, not self-deceive themselves in terms of saying, I can do something or my company will do something that it's not set up to do?
Yeah, Don, I think it's the single hardest thing about being an entrepreneur. You have to balance this confidence. Um, Confidence in the face of failure, right? I mean, statistically, the odds are, pick a number, 2 out of 3 times you're going to fail. And just the act of becoming an entrepreneur in the face of that means you need to be confident or overconfident. And you need to project that. People, investors respond to it, team members respond to it, people will be motivated. But at the same time, you invest so much energy into selling the vision that if you need to change the vision, because the vision, as is often the case for entrepreneurs, turns out to be off target in some important way, and then now you got to go back to the same people and they say, well, I know I told you that we were going here, but now we're going there, and that takes a very resilient ego, so there is no easy explanation for how people can handle that. There's just a whole bunch of cognitive dissonance that's going to be from trying to be that human who can sort of both have that confidence, but also the flexibility. And, I think surrounding yourself with a team that trusts you, having somebody on your team who will call you out if you're starting to be too stubborn and too attached to your vision, or investors who will do that, a good board of directors who's managed this kind of dynamic before. It helps a lot to just sort of warn people in advance that this is what's happening. Like, I really, really believe this now. And I'm very excited, and I want you to be excited too. But, we're going to try it. And if it isn't working, we're going to shift in a new direction, and we'll all get excited about that too. So if you actually manage the expectation that there will be pivots, it makes them a little easier to manage. But that's easy to say, hard to do.
Share a little bit more about that last point that you just made. It's actually the first point in your book in terms of the bedfellows and how bad bedfellows can be a disaster. But based upon what you just said, it sounds like some good voices and some good minds around you can be very grounding in the entrepreneurial journey.
Yeah. So the notion of good idea, bad bedfellows, this is the tragedy of entrepreneurs who find a good concept. And there's some listeners will have heard of lean startup. It's this approach of stating your assumptions about your business in ways that can be tested, like the scientific method, if you will, test a hypothesis, and running tests that are lean in the sense that you do no more than absolutely necessary to get a signal, positive or negative, about whether the assumption's right. And sometimes entrepreneurs do all that. They sort of prove that there's demand, but they still can't assemble the all of the players who need to come together to build a business. And the case study in the book is of an apparel company, Quincy Apparel, and the co-founders here, to this point about how you're going to manage through some of these issues, were best friends, and vowed that they would never let conflict over the business come in the way of the friendship. And like so many MBAs that I work with, both envision themselves being the boss. And it's quite natural for co-founders early on. Co-founders may spend 3 months, 4 months before are there any other employees on board. So literally in that period, they are working side by side in the same room, talking through every decision. And it's quite natural for them to want to continue that going forward. And if you can't figure out which of the two of them is going to be the CEO, the boss, you can try to continue in that mode for a long time. But eventually the company is going to get big and complicated. And in this case, the co-founders had different visions for what the company should be doing. And they tangled over it, or they suppressed the conflict. Either can be dysfunctional. But they slowed themselves down just basically because they felt compelled to talk through every decision. And that can be good. You want a sounding board, but you also want somebody to be able to make the call. And an entrepreneur needs to be able to move fast. And so if you're slowing your decisions down because you need top level consensus on every one of them, that's a prescription for trouble. So yeah, they that, and then on top of that, neither of them had worked in a fashion company before, an apparel company, and some ventures are forgiving of that shortfall. You don't really need industry expertise to, if you're developing Instagram, you don't have to have worked for Kodak, or some kind of photo sharing company in order to be a successful entrepreneur. But turns out, like, if anybody listening has ever seen an entrepreneur launch a food or beverage company, the kind of stuff that goes into your supermarket, man, just like hundreds of decisions that you need somebody on your team who's done this stuff before, packaging, plotting allowances to sort of figure out how people will find your thing. Just unbelievable. So these entrepreneurs needed industry expertise and lacked it. And, they also couldn't figure out who was the boss. So they recruited the wrong team to compensate for their own lack of industry expertise. They hired people out of big companies who knew how to do all the specialized functions in an apparel company: fabric sourcer, pattern maker, quality control. And these folks, in an early stage startup, employees all need to dive in and put out whatever fire is burning hottest. Like 6-year-olds on a soccer field, sort of scrumming around the ball, swarm the thing. And these folks would say, like, look, I'm the pattern maker. I have no idea how to solve the problem that the fabric sourcer is having. So bad bedfellows, wrong team, wrong co-founders. I could go on and on about how the investors didn't add value and how the factories were actually manufacturing the stuff ignored them because they were a peanut who lacked industry relationships and reputations. So it could have been avoided in some ways.
So in the book, you looked at, I think, 470 failed startup attempts. And then I'm sure in your research, you've studied hundreds and hundreds more. Are there any that really stand out in terms of you identifying the company or the entrepreneur as a result of their failure, but then they've gone on to do something really interesting following it? Are there any that stand that way? And what kept those folks going, and what was it that prompted their success?
Yeah. So in addition to the book, I launched an MBA course on failure, and I did this with some trepidation. You heard that I have at the beginning. You mentioned I have a role, sort of leading a lot of the entrepreneurship programs, and I had a vision of creating this course and then reading in the news sites that talk about things related to MBA programs that entrepreneurship at Harvard, 5 years from now has dropped, is just canceled. That nobody's doing it. And then somebody will figure out that it was this course that sort of exposed people to failure and scared all the MBAs away. I was genuinely concerned about that. Turned out to be just the opposite. And there are, in fact, I ask at the end of the course, has the course changed the way you think about becoming an entrepreneur? And 20% say yes. I'm less likely. I saw you brought these people. I bring a failed founder into every class, and they meet them and they see the pain. And so these people say, I don't think so. Not me. Not anytime soon. 40% are at the other extreme. They say, I'm more likely to do it. You showed me the pain. Thank you. I think I can handle it. In fact, part of me wants to see. But more importantly, what these 40% say is, you brought in a bunch of people who are doing really, first off, they were impressive. So, I realized they failed, but they didn't fail because they were losers. Like, I met them. They're really smart people who recruited a good team and raised money from smart investors. And now look what they're doing. So, about half will go on and found again. A couple of the folks in the class became venture capitalists. So, and it's actually, for them, quite an asset, be able to look a founder in the eye and say, I did it. I failed. Here's what I learned from it. You're on the same path, and you need to course correct. And so this 40% of my students who are more likely to do it saw that you can bounce back from it, and it gave them a lot of it gave them more confidence to do it. Yeah, if I launch something statistically, I'm likely to fail too, but there's life on the other side. Now I got to be careful because I've curated, in order to teach the students, I brought in thoughtful founders. And as we said before, the thoughtful ones are more likely to sort of find a good path to the next thing. But I'll take it.
Yeah, for sure. So the entrepreneurs that you've talked to that have been involved in a failed entrepreneurial effort, do they regret it, or do most of them embrace it?
I do ask this question, and every few years I worry that the startup world is getting too bubbly, too much irrational exuberance, and we're probably going through exactly that right now, by the way. And a recent time was 2011. When I saw this coming and sort of valuation surging for venture capital backed startups. And I worried that my students were heading into entrepreneurship without really thinking about why and the risks and so forth, lemming-like. And so I wrote a bunch of my students from the class of 2000. Okay. This was a tragic MBA class because they spent their entire 2 years in the MBA program sort of watching the dot-com boom, the bubble expand. And then in March, of just before they graduated, the thing came to a crashing halt. Although we didn't quite know. I mean, it felt like it all came to a halt in March of 2000, but we'd gone through some ups and downs, so we didn't know this was the big one, the permanent thing. And so all these students who've been working on ventures for 2 years launched them, and nuclear winter set in. None of them survived. They all were crushed within a year or so. And so I surveyed these founders, and do you regret it? 19 out of 20 said no regrets, and the 20th said, I love being an entrepreneur now. He's back at it. I wish I had learned more on somebody else's dime, like that I hadn't launched my thing and lost other people's money that I signed up. So even he is still sort of a convinced entrepreneur. But what the 19 said was, this was the internet taking off. And I could have gone to work in a consulting firm or an investment bank or something and watched this from the sidelines, but I could have gone and been an employee in some company like number 20. But look, I was a general manager. I conceived the thing. I mobilized the team. We had a great team. We built a great product. I'm so proud of what we did. I learned so much. I had a level of responsibility that would be unparalleled to what if I'd been an employee in a company or a consultant. And how could I tell my grandchildren that I sat on the sidelines and worked in an investment bank when the internet was beginning? So yeah, they would go back and do it, even though it failed and even though it was incredibly painful.
Isn't the irony of that amazing, where people spend so much energy trying to avoid failure? And yeah, absolutely, you want to avoid failure. But there are some people that never get started because of the fear of failure.
Yeah.
Here you have 19 of 20 people that say, yeah, it didn't work out. And, if I had to do it all over again, knowing what I knew at the time, I'd do it again. And it's a fascinating irony that exists. Entrepreneurs get a ton of advice. What is the worst advice that you hear given to entrepreneurs?
The worst advice. There's so much advice. There's a lot of conventional wisdom about what makes a great entrepreneur. And here's the thing, it's not bad advice. So let me rattle off the things that an entrepreneur will be told. Grow, right? That's how we keep score in entrepreneurship. Stay focused, be persistent, be frugal, just do it, get going. And all of these things are smart and have a place. Followed blindly, that advice, though, I could take each of those and explain to you how followed blindly or followed to the extreme. Persistence can turn into stubbornness. Growing, you can grow too fast and put too much strain on the organization. So every one of them can lead to failure. And so you want to do it, but you just want to think. And right to the core, I think the advice that entrepreneurs love and get and embrace is trust your gut. And your biggest asset as an entrepreneur is your instinct. So trust your instinct and move fast. And indeed, moving fast is super important for an entrepreneur. But there are many decisions that an entrepreneur will face. There's Kahneman, Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist and psychologist. Wonderful book, Thinking Fast and Slow, talks about system one thinking, which is intuitive, sort of split second decision, and thinking slow, system two, where you sort of mull over the pros and cons and the trade-offs and so forth. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs would be better served if they did more on some decisions, more system two thinking slowly, sleeping on it 2 nights, developing lists, spreadsheets of pros and cons, showing that to somebody you trust who understands your strengths in your company. And yeah, so the advice I'd give.
Yeah, not to interrupt you, but talk to us a little bit about those decisions in terms of some of those decisions that warrant thinking slow. Give us some examples of those.
Boy, picking the co-founder, not
just drinking buddy, but
yeah. I mean, undoing that decision is like, if you think divorce, it can be painful. Boy, like unwinding a co-founder relationship, picking your investors. How fast to grow, whether your early adopters are, whether the signal, there's often for an entrepreneur a foaming at the mouth, enthusiastic, positive group of customers who love what you're doing at the beginning, and you need those people. But it's easy to get seduced into thinking everybody's going to be like them, expand too fast, or build a product that meets their needs. Sometimes the needs of the early, they're more sophisticated. So like they're looking for things that the mainstream customers may not want or need. And so all of these things, sort of slowing down and really figuring out what the trade-offs are and what the right decision is, and bouncing it off of people you trust. That's the way to go.
And what about a piece of advice for entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial leaders that isn't as common? Some of it you kind of see rehashed over and over and over again, but what's something that you've discovered in your research that perhaps is really valuable, but not as common?
Yeah. So the biggest surprise for me, it'll feel a little narrow, maybe for the listeners, but it is. I've hinted at it already in this conversation. Industry expertise, domain expertise, turns out to be pivotally important in some ventures, but not in others. And knowing whether the path you're on is a path that requires that expertise, and whether you've got it. And if you don't have it, how are you going to get it? Like, who on the team is going to bring it, or how will you personally acquire it? That's a big one. A big, and the false positive thing was new too, which I was just speaking about. The risk, and that's such a hard one for entrepreneurs, because you need those early adopters and you love them, and you're so excited that they found your product. It's easy to expand in their direction.
Yeah, I mean, that goes a little bit to what is the book called? I think it's called The Myth of the Garage by Chip and Dan Heath, as they were talking about how people have a picture of an entrepreneur as like a young tech wizard who's in his or her garage grinding away, coding, but really the typical entrepreneur is someone who is far older, far more experienced, has industry knowledge, and then is attempting a new application in terms of something they know about. Talk a little bit about that in terms of, there may be a lot of people out there that don't see themselves as an entrepreneur, but really perhaps are quite ripe to think about something entrepreneurially.
Yeah. That's it. You've accumulated life experience, insight about problems that haven't been met, know-how. I mean, it helps to, basically an entrepreneur's got to build a business. So one of the reasons, I get a lot of people who question, why in the world would an entrepreneur want to go to school? And how can you possibly study to be an entrepreneur? The answer is, it's a business, and it helps to know accounting and finance and marketing and all that. We teach that stuff in business school. So there are other ways to learn it. If you got the discipline to sit down with a book, or sort of take an online course, good luck. When you're working 70-hour weeks, trying to teach yourself accounting. Yeah, no, I think that so that's on the positive side of the ledger. There's other stuff on the negative side, which is when you're 38, the age at which I sort of set off to do my midlife crisis. You have a whole bunch of life responsibilities. You may have a mortgage. You may be paying for school, or you may be done paying off your student loans. That's the good news, but. So it can be harder to sort of, on the other hand, if you've built up a bank balance, then and you've got the couple of years of cash in the bank, so you can bootstrap for a while. That can be an asset. So there are all these forces, positive and negative, that will pull you toward and push you away from being an entrepreneur as you get older. Having a big personal network, big asset for an entrepreneur in their 30s or 40s. People and trust, but the big one is just sort of knowing something. Right, an entrepreneur has to be able to lead people who are going to take care of marketing and operations and so forth. So if you've done that on somebody else's dime, like my entrepreneur number 20. Helps.
I think it's an important point in terms of helping people realize that, failure is out there. It can become reality. And so the more that you prepare yourself for it, not because that's what you're striving toward, but just because creating a cushion with which to land and rebound in a moment of failure can be a wise thing for people to consider.
Yeah, exactly. That failure is something that you can rebound from and learn from, and can position you for future success. Failure hurts, but people get past it. And importantly, there are patterns, and you can actually reduce your odds of failure by understanding why other entrepreneurs have failed, and sort of taking steps to anticipate and avoid. And lastly, I would say there is such a thing as a good failure. There are the entrepreneurs who have an idea. The only way to figure out if it's a good idea is to do it. And if you do it, if you truly run lean, if you've done the right research up front, and then launch the business and test and have the mindset of an experimenter, and it turns out that your assumption was plausible but wrong, we should celebrate that. We as a society should want people to do that all day long, and investors should back those entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Eisenmann, this has just been a fantastic conversation. I'm so grateful for your time. Your book is called How Startups Fail, and a lot of information can be found about your work at the Harvard Business School website. And you lead not only the Rock Center for Entrepreneurship, but also the Harvard Innovation Lab. People can learn more about your work there. And we're just thrilled that you took the time to spend it with us today. Thank you so much for what you're doing in terms of researching this important topic, but also how you've contributed to this podcast today. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, John, thanks so much for what you're doing. Failing forward is so important, and putting a lens on it and helping people understand it. It's a gift. Thank you.